Good afternoon and welcome to Book Sandwiched In. Thank you for coming today. My name is Rebecca.Fuss. I'm with the Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library, and as always, thank you for your support in making programs like this possible. We welcome all of you and also our remote audience who are watching on Twitter. And if anyone from the remote audience has a question, be sure to send that in and we'll be able to ask our reviewer that question today. So in honor of our 60th anniversary Book Sandwiched In series, today's pop-up mini review highlights the Book Sandwiched In review of November 12th, 1957. And the book is Freedom or Secrecy by James Russell Wiggins. Wiggins' career in journalism began in Minnesota in the 1920s. While serving in the Army Air Corps Intelligence in World War II, he met Philip Graham, who would later become the publisher of the Washington Post, the paper that Mary McGrory later worked for. Graham made Wiggins managing editor of the Post in 1947 and promoted him to executive editor in 1955. Wiggins took over the Post editorial page in 1961, and in 1968 he was appointed by President Lyndon Johnson to be U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. His book, first published in 1956, was described as essential for anyone who wants to understand newspapers and who values the freedoms that a free press can help preserve, to awaken people to the grave danger to their liberties. You can check it out today if you want to. The reviewer here in Central Library in 1957 was Cliff Carpenter. Does anybody remember that name? He had his career in newspapers as well, with the Gannett chain from 1928 until his retirement as editor of the D&C editorial page in 1973. And he wrote several columns about his beloved Hay Island in the Thousand Islands, which appeared in the D&C between 1968 and 1973. And RPL has the compilation of those articles as well. And this is available to take home today if you'd like to do that. So today we're looking at Mary McGrory, the first queen of journalism. And our reviewer is Rochester's answer to Mary McGrory, Meaghan McDermott. After covering the town of Greece and myriad suburban education issues for the Democrat and Chronicle over the last few years, Meaghan is taking up coverage of taxes, government spending, and property rights issues. Don't feel bad for her. She likes numbers and likes knowing where her tax dollars are going. Meaghan is a member of the D&C's investigative team, focusing on taxes, government spending, and property rights. She's covered everything from backyard chickens to a bullied school bus driver, and looked into topics including corruption within the ranks of a local police department, shoddy construction work in a multi-million-dollar renovation project in an area school district, and the frequency of wrong-way crashes on area roadways. She grew up in Chilai and is a graduate of the college at Brockport. Please join me in welcoming Meaghan McDermott to the podium today.
Hi, good afternoon. I wanted to thank you all for coming out today to today's Book Sandwiched In. Oh, I'm sorry, a little bit closer? All right. Hopefully that'll work this time. I'm much better on the written page, so please bear with me as I talk to you. But I understand this is the library's 60th season of these reviews, and I'm very proud to be here today talking about John Norris's Mary McGrory, the first queen of journalism. As you know, my name's Meaghan. I'm an investigative reporter with the Democrat and Chronicle. I've been there since 1998. And while my beat might sound boring, it really isn't. I get to write about how much you're paying in taxes, where those tax dollars go, and that's all very, very important. I came into the newspaper in a really unconventional way. I used to be a restaurant manager and went back to school. I answered a classified ad in the newspaper. Do you remember those? Newspapers? Yeah. Or classified ads, you remember those too, I suppose, right? But I answered the ad, and they were looking for what was called an editorial assistant, and basically my job then was to answer the phones at night and write up church dinner briefs. And I went along doing that for a few months. And then Newbie Noyes, Mary McGrory's editor, in her first days working at the Washington Star, had come up to her desk and with a bottle of cold root beer and said, "I have something different I'd like you to do." And she had said, "Well, what might that be?" And that's what sparked her career. I don't have any bottles of root beer or editors who came up to my desk asking me to do something different. But what did happen to me was I was working one night, and the night reporter was out at a crime scene. And I was there with the night editor, and somebody's furnace blew up in Clarkson. And they needed another reporter to go, but didn't have one. So the editor called me over. Her name was Laura Nichols. She handed me a skinny white notebook and a pen and said, "I need you to go." I said, "Oh, okay, I think I can do that. What do I do when I get there?" She said, "Well, find the man in the white shirt and ask him what's going on." I drove out to Clarkson. I found the man in the white shirt, who was the fire chief, asked him what was going on, and the rest, I guess, brings us here to today. And one thing that I do have in common with Mary McGrory is, like she said of her profession, mine also keeps me off the streets. Things that I don't have in common with her, though, are her sublime way with words, her incredible eye for detail, her ease in cultivating these relationships with powerful politicians, and really her love of a good glass of scotch. As she wrote in her book, one of the most disappointing things that happened when she moved over from the Washington Star to the Post was that all of their newsroom parties involved just cake. Just cake. And I don't mind having just cake at our newsroom parties, although Norris's warm biography does make me nostalgic for a newsroom I was never part of. One where McGrory painstakingly typed out her columns and labored over every word, where she balled up little bits of paper as she went, as she struggled through finding the right words, something that one of her coworkers called all of her anguishes. And at the end of it, in the next morning when he would come in, he could see these little bits of paper around on the floor, and I think said to her one night, "There were 38 anguishes on the floor. You must have had a heck of a time writing that column." Though, as a reporter, you do anguish over every word that you put into a story, so I can certainly commiserate with Mary's feeling and all of her anguishes. And Mary had said of investigative reporters that they have the brass that it takes to go up to a total stranger and take them by the lapels and say, "Now you tell me." She said that was something that she didn't have. She said of what she did for a living, it's all been handed to me on a platter. I just have to sit here and take it all in. It's much easier than going around knocking on doors at midnight and meeting people in underground parking spaces in the dead of night. Only once did I ever meet someone in an underground parking garage to get a packet of documents, and that was probably one of the highlights of that year anyway. It felt very journalistic, right? Someone calls you up on the phone, says, "I have something that I want to hand you, meet me in a parking garage." All of a sudden you think you're Bob Woodward. But I don't think Mary's observation was true at all. Really, a hallmark of her work was that she always worked her sources, and maybe sometimes in kind of cozy, insidery ways that make my own journalistic teeth itch a bit. And she was very, very close to her sources. Nonetheless, she saw fit to ask the tough questions. She was the one who quietly spoke up in the aftermath of Richard Nixon's resignation, and Gerald Ford was sworn in as president. One of the press secretaries came out and said, "Now is not the time for partisan recriminations." And Mary, in her soft little voice, said, "If now isn't the time for partisan recriminations, when would be the time?" And her friend Maureen Dowd, another well-known columnist, had said, "Every public figure she has elegantly sautéed has learned to beware when Mary sounds confused and begins asking seemingly innocent questions. You are about to enter the McGrory house of pain." And actually that is a very effective technique sometimes. If you act a little befuddled and please explain that to me, it works out quite well. But let's talk about brass and the kind Mary had. the kind that stiffened the spine of the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for commentary, her articles on the Watergate scandal. This was a woman, after all, who was delighted to discover her name was on Nixon's enemies list. She said it was the nicest thing that ever happened to her. And as a matter of fact, Nixon, in trying to punish his enemies, as I guess he was wont to do, had set her up for an IRS audit. And in the course of that audit, the auditors discovered that Mary actually hadn't properly documented all of her charitable contributions. She didn't write down enough of them. She had made more contributions than she had reported to the IRS, and she ended up getting almost $200 refunded. So I guess that was a bit of a backfire. And then who could forget Mary's 1962 column after Nixon lost the California governor's race, which she began, "For Richard M. Nixon, it was exit snarling." And she concluded, "No questions had been asked by Mr. Nixon of himself. No questions had been asked except by Mr. Nixon of himself. None actually remained, the former vice president having disposed of everything, including possibly his reputation, in his epic tirade." She had a way with words and a way of observing things so closely and really distilling everything down to its utter essence and skewering those who deserved it with ultimate precision. And that takes some brass. And it takes quite a bit of brass, too, to go from her humble beginnings as a go from the humble beginnings of her Boston Irish Catholic roots in Roslindale, Massachusetts, to becoming someone the Washington Post later said was the most prominent liberal columnist of the post-World War II era. And her remarkable body of work spans from the McCarthy hearings to Colin Powell's defense of the invasion of Iraq. And Mary always thought of herself not as a columnist, but as a reporter who'd been given free license to deliver her opinions. That's unusual for a reporter. Normally we aren't allowed to opine on the subjects we're writing about. We strive for objectivity. But for Mary, that worldview sometimes conflicted with her editors and led to numerous fights, apparently, over whether or not her columns belonged in the A section of the paper or the editorial pages of the paper. That's where the news was, and that's what Mary wrote, even if she did have her own opinions about it. Because she did cover the news. 12 presidential campaigns she covered throughout her career, and everything in between. Sometimes a little gardening. She wrote about a few other things that she liked. 5 decades of work, more than 8,000 columns, and she plumbed the anthropology of American politics. And even from the beginning, her skill was apparent. When Newbie Noyes had tapped her in 1954, she was sent out to cover the Army McCarthy hearings. She wrote, over the course of, I think, 36 days, 36 separate columns that ended up reaching the final round of consideration for the Pulitzer Prize. Her first time out, she'd been a book reviewer working for the Star before Noyes had come to her and asked her to start writing her opinion columns. Now, Mary loved to party. She was quite a well-known hostess. She would throw a lot of parties. She loved to cook, as John Norris tells us, though apparently she wasn't particularly good at that. There were a couple of tales of perhaps some illnesses related to one of her lasagnas, and I think it was that Maureen Dowd said, "Never try her Jell-O surprise." But Mary wore Chanel. She lived in this Mad Men-style world that's really foreign to me as a reporter here in Rochester, but maybe more emblematic, I think, of the Washington Press Corps and the way that they kind of operate, where rubbing elbows with the rich and powerful and the well-connected is much more commonplace and just a part of doing business. I mean, Mary McGrory once dated John Kennedy. Eugene McCarthy sent her a love poem scribbled on the back of a tourist certificate that they picked up during a drive around Lake Superior. Lyndon Johnson propositioned her. But the world that she lived in is the world we live in, and we have her body of work to chronicle what happened during that time. Just as an aside, reading through Norris's work, I kept thinking about how Mary would fare in today's world of social media, because journalism is changing so much. And rather than just sort of sticking to our printed pages or to television, we have to tweet and we post on Facebook. And there are all these different outlets that are competing with us. We have Gawker and Politico and Breitbart and just all of these online sources where the mixing of opinion and reporting is much more common. And I think that Mary would do well. You know, one of my favorite pieces from this book, her little flash of temper that she would have sometimes. Norris shared a sharp telegram that she had sent to Bobby Kennedy after he announced in January 1968 that he wasn't going to run that year against LBJ. McGrory was succinct. She sent him a note that said, "St. Patrick did not drive all of the snakes out of Ireland." And I wonder how that remarkable brevity in her piercing prose would have fared today. You know, so I did a little quick experiment, because I think she would have been a master of the tweet. She would have been able to shoot out these just constantly piercing prose in 140 characters, little rapiers, you know, just poking people. I think she was a master of this form even before it existed. So I took to Twitter to find out. So here's a couple others. On Joseph McCarthy, she said, "I had seen his likes all my life, at wakes, at weddings, at the junior prom. He was an Irish bully boy." Now that fits in a tweet with 38 characters to spare. Of Nixon, she said, "A sense of grievance is not a good paramount quality in a president." That, she'd have 78 additional characters with which to eviscerate the man of which she'd once said, "If he were horse, I would not buy him." A couple other fantastic pre-Twitter tweets she would have put out on Bush v. Gore, a battle between the unlikable and the unprepared. Or this one: "If the Whitewater hearings were a series, it would have been canceled. If a show, closed, and if a horse, shot. If Clinton had any shame, he would have long since expired of it." She was truly ahead of her time, and she really would have killed it on Facebook, too. You know, one of the interesting points that Norris brought up in the book is that while McGrory ended up being a bit of a feminist icon, it was never a mantle that she wanted to assume. She really sort of eschewed that entire movement. And as Norris had recounted, reporter Jack German said, "Mary was not of the women's movement in any way, and she did not like being identified with it. She always treated women with, as we say, minimum high regard." But still, famous journalists like Cokie Roberts have said McGrory's contributions were significant, even if she did issue with aligning herself with the movement. As Roberts said, that Mary was very much a trailblazer for the women coming after her, and we couldn't have done what we did if not for her. And McGrory never was shy about using her gender to her advantage either. As Norris noted, she would sit patiently on the little leather benches below the old oil portraits of the politicians in the speaker's lobby off the floor in the House of Representatives, and she'd lie there and wait for members of Congress. Because it was very important to her always throughout her entire career. She did the shoe leather reporting. She never just relied on reading what somebody else had said, or she went to the sources directly, she worked them, she got really the information that they were providing directly, firsthand. And that's admirable. I mean, she wasn't just someone who sat up and pontificated on subjects of which she knew nothing. But her patience in sitting there, waiting for the members of Congress, was usually rewarded. And as she had said, "Men naturally like to explain things to women. And I have given them exceptional opportunities in that regard." And this was a woman who loved what she did, and she loved where she got to do it. She said it was heaven. She said, "Newsrooms are large places full of messy desks and lippy people who hang around gossiping and making cheeky remarks about their betters. And on a good day, I like to think that's what we do too over at the Democrat and Chronicle. We're pretty lippy and sometimes cheeky, and at least I can admit to being fairly messy. Although we're moving over into a new building, at the 1st of May. We're moving out of the building here on Exchange Boulevard into new digs over on Main Street. So I've had to pare down all of my collections. We each get one box, roughly about this size, to bring over with us. So I'm not nearly as messy as I used to be. And another important aspect of Mary's life was her lifelong sense of social justice. She was a devout Catholic who believed in the necessity of good works. And she ended up being nicknamed Mary Gloria by the children at the St. Anne's Infant and Mortality House, where she volunteered her time weekly during all the years she lived in Washington. She rarely missed a Mass, and she did believe that the entire point of religion was to assist the oppressed and the less fortunate, and viewed her social justice as the cornerstone of responsible Catholicism. She brought the children at the orphanage presents. She paid their tuitions. She helped out the young mothers who were waiting there to have their babies. And she used her considerable influence to get the politicians to pay attention to the orphanage and to come in. She even garnered visits there by people like Bill and Hillary Clinton or Nancy Reagan. Norris chronicled McGrory's complex network of personal, professional, and political relationships using extensive interviews with her family, her friends, her papers left behind, and her columns. And her life was, really inexorably intertwined with the complicated politics of the era. And Norris made pretty clear that she had also served as an important advisor to political candidates and political players she admired, and sometimes so much so that she really blurred the lines of objectivity. And that was fascinating, really absolutely fascinating. She was very much opposed to the Vietnam War, and that really colored all of her writings and her columns throughout that later period of the 1960s and into the 70s. And she, I said before, she had hobnobbed with the Kennedys. She was friendly with these people. She had even, with the orphans, she even would get Bobby Kennedy to bring the orphans over for annual swimming parties at his home. But those personal feelings that she had about the people and the processes of government and how things work together were also an inexorable part of her reporting and an indelible piece of the voice that she brought to so many newspapers across the country. And Norris kind of skillfully weaves McGrory's personal story in and around some of the most consequential moments in the U.S. history of the second half of the U.S. history in the second half of the 20th century and the beginnings of the 21st. And the book is a fascinating exploration of not only McGrory, but the political climates and times that she chronicled and covered. Really, this is sort of an aside, but there's so many similarities I was feeling during reading this between kind of the political climate going on now and some of the things that were happening in the later 60s, time that I wasn't necessarily here for that, but just the clashing of moods and political ideologies within the country seems so very familiar to read them again through his eyes and through McGrory's work. But for McGrory, what she did in chronicling that history was who she was. And she had said herself, I always never wanted to be anything but a newspaper woman. And I still don't want to be, and that word is going to go on my gravestone. Because I think it is a very proud and wonderful thing to do. But I should confess, although I probably shouldn't, that I've always felt a little sorry for people who don't work for newspapers. There's some days I think I would agree with her. Other days, not quite so much, perhaps. But heartbreakingly, for a woman who was so astute with her language and so talented with verse, McGrory on March 14th, 2003 suffered a stroke that robbed her of language. She was gripped by aphasia, and she could no longer communicate. She understood everything that was being said to her. But a friend, Lance Gay, had said she would respond, but she couldn't make a coherent sentence. It was all gibberish. And in a rare moment, she was able to say to a friend of hers, Phil Gailey, the phrase, worse than death. But unable to continue with her column after that, although she tried very hard. She tried as many therapies as she could, as many occupational therapists, but she was never able to regain her speech. She retired. Finally, and a year later, she died on April 21st, 2004. But her place in the pantheon of America's great political commentators is secure. And on her headstone, indeed, it says, Mary McGrory, newspaper woman and volunteer. Very simple. And in that, I guess I'll sort of end my discussion of the book with what was really my favorite sentiment, and that Norris had put in. And it was really one that's on the very first page of the book, and it was a piece of advice that Mary gave to an intimidated relative once at a Washington buffet. But I think it translates well into every aspect of life, and it's something, I hope to do myself. She said, always approach the shrimp bowl like you own it. And Mary certainly always did, and I hope that's something we all can learn to do too. Good. So I've got a pretty healthy crowd out here wondering if I had any questions.
Excellent presentation.
Well, thank you.
And I understand that Mary McGrory had a Rochester connection. Can you tell us about that?
I actually, I do not know anything about Mary's Rochester connection. I apologize for my ignorance.
It wasn't in the book then?
It was not.
No.
It would have stood out. What do you know that I don't?
I read this many years ago, and I don't know whether it was New Harlem or she didn't work for Gannett, I guess.
No. She did not work for Gannett. She worked for the Washington Star, and then when that went out of business in the late 70s, I think, shortly after being bought by Time magazine, she ended up working at the Washington Post, which was a bit of a bit distressing for her, as the Star and the Post had been competing papers throughout all of her career, and she always thought that the Star was a fun and freewheeling and wonderful place to be, and the Post was a bit of a stuffy old aunt who was no fun whatsoever. So it was very disappointing to her. And I think, at least according to Norris's book, she never really felt as comfortable with the Post as she had working for the Star. She made some remarks about how her coworkers there never thought it was good to take the time to say good morning. So I think that's kind of an interesting observation on the climate there. Very good.
You mentioned, or Norris mentioned, all of the political figures that she seemed to be quite friendly with. Is there any hint that any of that familiarity influenced any of her writing? And then would you comment perhaps on your own situation?
Well, sure. She was very familiar, and I would say it's certain that her familiarity and her friendships with these powerful political people informed her writing. She worked on Eugene McCarthy's campaign. She was an advisor to both Kennedys, John and Bobby. And yes, like I said, she really sort of blurred the line, I think. She had parties at her home where all these political people would be invited, which to me, and I'll tell you, that's incredibly foreign to me. I mean, I would not be comfortable in the least. I can be very friendly with people, but I don't think it's appropriate for me to write about my friends. And then I sort of feel as though I would lose the ability to be objective. But I don't know that that's what Mary was doing. She was an opinion writer, after all, even if she was in the A pages. Yes, go ahead.
As a follow-up to that question, you said that she worked as advisor to Eugene McCarthy and the Kennedys.
The Kennedys, yes.
This was while she was working at the paper?
Sure, yes, it was. She did advise Gene McCarthy and the Kennedys while she was working for the paper. Apparently at that time, it wasn't as though she was a paid advisor. She wasn't on their campaign payrolls, but she was very friendly with them, and they would chat with her, and she would offer advice, and there was some speculation that I think there was an observation perhaps that she tended to fall in love with very politically powerful men. And go ahead.
Was Mary particularly good looking?
Was Mary particularly good looking? She certainly was considered to be so. She was very popular, although very devoutly Catholic, so she wasn't particularly She didn't seem to date quite a lot, but certainly there were plenty of gentlemen callers, I think, who would have found her very attractive. Go ahead.
What was her educational background that led her to the writing?
Her educational background, I believe she had attended Boston Latin Girls School as a youngster in Boston, which was one of the top-rated schools in the city at that time, and I think that she went to Emmanuel College, if I'm remembering correctly. And she came into the Star really with no connections and no clips, no real nobody to really get her in the door at the newspaper, and she had started working as a book reviewer, I think, and she had, at one point in time, if I'm remembering correctly, she somehow, her writing impressed the editors of the New York Times Review of Books so much that they told her to send something in, and she ended up getting a review published in that, which was pretty unusual for a woman at that time, and also because she was so young and relatively unknown and untested. So she didn't come in with a, Harvard degree, or, she was, working class girl from Boston. And you, sir, had a question.
Will you describe the latitude that you have from the DNC in your investigative reporting?
The latitude that I have from the DNC in my investigative reporting, in terms of...
Do you choose your subject and report on it, or do you have prescribed issues directly?
Do I get to choose my own subjects, or am I assigned stories? A little bit of both. Sometimes there'll be a story that my editors will determine they think needs a little bit more investigation, or sometimes I see that myself, so I can go out and just sort of pursue those, and I'll pitch those stories. Sometimes stories just kind of happen organically that require a little bit more looking into. We'll say, for example, Comida. Yeah. It's a hot topic at the moment. Sure, go ahead, sir.
If I remember correctly, her column was carried in the local papers.
I believe that is correct. I failed in my duty to check before I left the office today, but I grew up here in Rochester, and we were a 3-newspaper family for a while. We got the Times-Union, the Democrat and Chronicle, and the USA Today once that started printing in the 80s. So I am certain that I would have read her columns pretty faithfully, since I was an avid reader of the paper. I don't know if does anyone here know if she was in the DNC or the TU?
I do.
She was in the TU? Very good. Well, that made sense. She was in an afternoon paper for a very long time. I think it was the Post. She had to start being in a morning paper, and that was a big adjustment for her too, because she used to like to work on her stories late into the night, and that couldn't happen with a morning paper.
She said she wasn't a feminist.
Correct. She said she was not. Do I think she was? I think that by virtue of what she did, she was. I don't think she had to adopt any labels for herself, but by being one of the first women, I mean, certainly there were other women working at the time. Helen Thomas, comes to mind. There were a lot of other women in newsrooms, but just by virtue of being there in the newsroom, being on the bus, being one of the boys on the bus in the campaign trail, and she knocked them back. She drank with them. She partied with them. She was considered one of the boys. She could, I think, swear like a sailor. One of my favorite things, though, that she always did was she always got the other journalists, the men on the bus, to carry her bags, which I thought was funny. She sort of said, I might as well. So good for her. Yes, go ahead.
Was it well written?
Oh, the book was fantastic. Absolutely. It moved along beautifully. Norris was very skillful in weaving a wonderful history lesson of everything that had happened from the 1950 to almost the present day, and using McGrory's observations and her life as sort of a window to show America during that time period. It was a wonderful read. It moved along very quickly. His language was spectacular. And you could really feel his own sort of love for McGrory. And I believe that they had become friends before she had passed away, so they knew each other. But you could really feel the warmth and consideration that he had for her in the work. Any other? Good. Very good. What was,
So she's an investigative reporter in the past, you're an investigative reporter. Did you see anything in the book that you as an especially a female investigator or a reporter, learned or like picked up as a hint or a tip or something that you might try?
something I might try. Again, always sort of going back to let's approach that shrimp bowl like you own it. I mean, one of the things that you need to do as an investigative reporter is kind of get over your concerns and fears about whether people like you, right? Because I'm going to go ask you questions you don't want to answer, and you're going to think I'm a jerk, right? And then I'm going to write about it, and you're probably not going to like me there either. But, that's what I do. That's my job. And you have to approach things with the bravery and the kind of brass that Mary had. You really do. Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here, and I very much appreciate being asked to join you.